December 31st, 2019, was supposed to be just another quiet New Year's Eve at my remote cabin in northern Minnesota. I'm a writer, and I'd chosen this isolated spot specifically to work on my novel without distractions. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, and the narrow access road was barely passable in winter. Perfect for focusing on my work. I remember checking my watch at 11:30 p.m., thinking I might actually make it to midnight this year instead of falling asleep at my desk. That's when I heard the first knock. It wasn't particularly loud or aggressive, just 3 gentle taps on my front door. But something about the sound made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Maybe it was because I knew how impossible it was for anyone to be out there. The last weather report I'd checked showed a major blizzard moving in, and the temperature was well below zero. I muted my laptop and listened. 3 more knocks, exactly the same as before. I tried to convince myself it was just ice falling from the roof or branches hitting the house, but then I heard a voice, a child's voice. "Please let me in. I'm so cold." My heart nearly stopped. The voice was clear as day, despite the howling wind outside. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but of course, no signal. The storm must have knocked out the cell tower again. "I can see you through the window," the voice said. "Please help me. I'm freezing." I knew I shouldn't look. Everything in my body was screaming at me not to look. But I had to know. I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peek out. There was a little girl standing on my porch, maybe 7 or 8 years old. She wore a thin white dress, totally inappropriate for the weather, and no shoes. Her skin was so pale it seemed to glow in the darkness, and she was looking directly at me with pleading eyes. "Please," she mouthed through the glass. "It hurts." I'm not proud of what I did next, but something deep inside me knew this wasn't right. I backed away from the window and grabbed the shotgun I keep for emergencies. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely load it. The knocking started again, harder this time. "Why won't you help me?" The voice had changed. There was an edge to it now, something angry and ancient. "Don't you want to party? It's almost midnight." I heard more voices joining in, adults, children, elderly, all asking to be let in, all promising that they just wanted to celebrate the new year with me. The knocking spread to every door and window of the cabin, a desperate percussion that seemed to make the whole house vibrate. Through the windows, I could see them now, dozens of figures in white, pressed against the glass. Their faces were wrong somehow, like they'd been drawn by someone who'd only had human faces described to them but had never actually seen one. At 11:59, everything went silent. Then one voice, that first little girl, spoke again. "Fine. We'll just have to come in another way." "The fireplace." Oh God, the fireplace. I heard them in the chimney, scrabbling and scratching their way down. I ran to my bedroom and barricaded the door, but I could hear them entering the cabin, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. They sang Auld Lang Syne as they searched for me, their voices distorted and out of sync, like a broken music box. I could see their shadows under my door, moving in ways that defied physics. The temperature in the room dropped so low that my breath came out in thick white clouds. The doorknob began to turn, despite the chair I'd wedged under it. I raised the shotgun, knowing it would probably be useless against whatever these things were. Just before midnight, just before they got in, the power went out. I spent the next 6 hours in total darkness, listening to them move around my cabin, singing and laughing and calling my name. When dawn finally came, they were gone. The cabin was exactly as I'd left it, except for the living room, where dozens of wet, bare footprints covered the floor and walls and ceiling, all leading to the fireplace. I sold the cabin 3 months later. The real estate agent told me it had been built on the site of an old orphanage that burned down on New Year's Eve in 1923. All the children had been dressed in white nightgowns for a holiday party. None of them survived. The new owners only lasted 2 weeks before putting it back on the market. They wouldn't say why, but I know. Every New Year's Eve, those children are still looking for someone to party with. Worked as a private security guard for 15 years, but what happened on New Year's Eve 2018 at the Ashbrook Hotel made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. They say time is linear, that the past stays in the past, but after that night, I'm not so sure anymore. The Ashbrook was hosting their annual New Year's Eve gala, you know, the kind where rich people pay thousands just to toast champagne at midnight. I was stationed in the security room, monitoring the cameras. Everything was normal until 11:47 p.m., when the feed from the grand ballroom started showing inconsistencies. At first, I thought it was just camera glitches. The timestamps would jump backward a few seconds, then forward again. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The guests were moving differently in each reset. Not just slightly different, completely different paths, different conversations, different actions. It was like watching multiple alternate realities playing out simultaneously. I radioed my partner Mark to check the ballroom. His voice came back shaky, "Jim, you need to get down here." When I arrived, the ballroom looked normal, except every single guest was frozen in place, mid-motion, like someone had hit pause on reality itself. The only thing moving was the giant crystal chandelier, swaying ever so slightly though there wasn't any breeze. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. As the clock struck midnight, instead of cheers and celebration, every guest simultaneously turned their head to stare directly at me. Their eyes were completely white, no pupils, no iris. And they spoke in perfect unison, "You don't belong in this timeline." I backed away toward the exit, but the doors had vanished, just smooth wall where they should have been. The guests began moving toward me in perfect synchronization, their movements jerky and unnatural, like broken marionettes. The air grew thick and heavy, and I could taste metal in my mouth. That's when the screaming started. Not from the guests, they were still moving in that horrible silence. The screams were coming from behind the walls, thousands of voices crying out in agony. The chandelier's crystals began to vibrate, producing a high-pitched whine that made my teeth ache. I fumbled for my phone to call for backup, but the screen showed the same time over and over, 11:47 p.m. The temperature in the room plummeted. I could see my breath, and frost began forming on the windows. The guests were getting closer, their blank eyes fixed on me, their mouths now stretching into impossible grins that literally went from ear to ear. Mark appeared beside me, but when I turned to him, his face was wrong. It was like someone had taken all his features and shifted them slightly to the left. "You've seen too much," he said, but his mouth didn't move. "This party has been going on for eternity, and it will continue for eternity." I don't remember how I got out. My next clear memory is waking up in my car in the hotel parking lot at 3 a.m. The ballroom was dark and empty when security checked it the next day. The guest list showed no record of any New Year's Eve party being booked. The chandelier was gone, though the mounting bracket was still there. I quit my job the next day. But sometimes, when I drive past the Ashbrook at night, I swear I can see lights and movement in that ballroom. And every year on New Year's Eve, my phone displays the same time, no matter how many times I reset it, 11:47 p.m. I used to think number stations were just an interesting Cold War relic, you know, those mysterious shortwave radio broadcasts that just repeat strings of numbers. I was a ham radio enthusiast, and I'd heard plenty of them over the years. But what I encountered on New Year's Eve 2020 was something else entirely. I was doing my usual late-night scanning of frequencies, more out of habit than anything else. Most of my radio friends were at parties, but I preferred the quiet company of my equipment. At 11:30 p.m., I picked up a signal I'd never heard before. 777. New Year 777. The voice was mechanical, clearly computer-generated, but there was something off about it. Between each number, I could hear what sounded like breathing. Not normal breathing, it was wet, labored, like someone drowning. I grabbed my logbook and started writing down the numbers. 7 repeated exactly 47 times, then switched to for 23 repetitions, then 1 for 15 repetitions. The pattern made no sense according to any cipher I knew. At 11:45, the numbers stopped. The breathing got louder, and I heard what sounded like dozens of voices whispering in the background. I should have turned it off then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I connected my computer to record the broadcast. That's when things got weird. My monitor flickered and displayed the same numbers in rapid succession. But they weren't just appearing on screen, they were burning themselves into my display, leaving permanent marks. The whispering got louder, and I could finally make out what they were saying. He's listening. He's recording. He's next. My radio's display started showing impossible frequencies, numbers that couldn't exist in the radio spectrum. The temperature in my radio room dropped so fast that frost formed on my windows. The breathing sound had turned into a gurgling noise, like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of liquid. Then a new voice came through, clear, human, and terrified. Please, you have to help us. We've been trapped here since the last broadcast. Every New Year's Eve, they make us read the numbers. They won't let us stop. They won't let us die. Static overwhelmed the voice, but in the white noise, I could make out faces. Human faces, contorted in agony, forming and dissolving in the random patterns. My computer started cycling through every file on its hard drive, opening and closing them at impossible speeds. At 11:59, the numbers started again, but this time I could hear the pain in the computerized voice. Each number was a scream converted to digital audio. My speakers began to leak a black, oily substance that smelled like copper and decay. Midnight hit, and every piece of electronic equipment in my room turned on at once, even things that weren't plugged in. Through every speaker, through the static on every screen, they all broadcast the same message: thank you for listening. You are now part of the transmission. Please begin your broadcast. My fingers started moving on their own, reaching for the microphone. I could feel the numbers burning in my throat, trying to claw their way out. I ripped out the power cable and smashed my radio equipment, but I could still hear the broadcast in my head. I spent the next year dreading what would happen the following New Year's Eve. When it came, I locked myself in a cabin with no electronics, no phones, nothing that could receive or transmit. But at 11:30 p.m., I felt the familiar pull. The numbers were there, waiting to be spoken. I'm writing this now because people need to know. If you're scanning radio frequencies on New Year's Eve and you hear a station broadcasting 777, turn it off immediately. Don't record it. Don't write down the numbers. Just stop listening. Because now I understand what those numbers mean. They're not a code or a message, they're a countdown. A countdown to the day when there will be enough of us, enough broadcasters, to drown out every other frequency in the world. And we're almost there.